Hello, and thanks for joining us for the Model Aviation Construction Series podcast. This is Jay Smith, Model Aviation and Park Pilot Editor-in-Chief, and I'll be your host. I'm also excited to have Paul Coleman join us. Paul authored the MA Construction Series that ran in Model Aviation from March of 2015 through January 2016. Paul also designed the Miles M20 and the Grumman Goose for the magazine. Hi, Paul.
Hey, Jay.
Paul, why don't we start off by giving the readers a brief background of your involvement with aeromodeling?
You bet. I did a little bit of modeling when I was a kid. I was always really interested in aircraft because my dad was in the Air Force, and my grandfather was an aerospace engineer. So, of course, I always wanted to get into RC when I was a kid, but that was really expensive. And as many of your readers are aware, things have gotten quite a bit cheaper and a lot more reliable. So about 10 years ago, when I realized the current state of the hobby, I decided to give it a whirl.
Okay. And could you give us, obviously you do a lot of building and you've done the construction series for us, so could you give us an overview of your building space?
Sure. Yeah, I actually have a small workbench in my garage. It's actually not a very large area. The bench is probably about 5 or 6 feet of work area. I guess that's part of why my designs tend to be a little bit on the smaller side. But that's enough room to build stuff that has 4 foot, 5 foot wingspan, something in that range. That's kind of where I tend to concentrate currently. But it's not really very glamorous. It's just the back wall of the garage and some cabinetry around it for supplies and small parts and good lighting. And just pretty basic workspace.
And what are you building on top of? What are you using, like a door skin, or what are you using to build on? Ceiling tile?
I found a really straight hardwood shelf years ago, and I just rolled down a piece of quarter-inch thick cork on the top of that. And I spray mounted that cork on top of the wood shelf, and found that cork is a pretty true surface, surprisingly true as received, but you can sand it every once in a while and clean it up, and that's actually served me for about 11 years now, so it's going strong and seems to be working pretty well.
In your workspace out there, Paul, do you have a fan, or do you have any type of device for when you're sanding or using adhesives, or what do you do about that?
Well, no, that's a good question. I probably should get some better ventilation for sanding. I try to do as much outside as I can. I live in Northern California, so we get a fair amount of good weather here. But as far as solvents and glues and stuff, I try not to do that stuff at the bench. I try to avoid CA as much as I can. I really don't care for the smell. I know a lot of people become sensitive to it, so it's not too big of a problem. The ventilation, since I'm using mostly wood glues for construction and some epoxy.
Right. And obviously, throughout the time of doing the 2 construction articles and all of the monthly MA Build series, I'm sure, as we've talked about in the past, that you've received questions from the readers. So could you share maybe some of the most common questions that you received?
Well, the biggest area of interest, I think, so far has been there's been a lot of questions about painting. And what I'm finding is that there's an awful lot of builders out there that they're good at framing and understand how to put the airplanes together, but painting is always a little tricky. It's very dependent on the type of covering that's used, and getting results can be tough to come by. So I can't say that the technique I'm using is the perfect technique, but definitely resonated with a lot of people that are looking for solutions that are better than the ones they've currently been using.
What about the actual construction, either of the Miles M20 or just construction in general? Did you get many questions on construction?
Yeah, there's been some questions here and there. Mostly the questions that have come in have been more general, not too many that are specific to the construction of the M20, but a lot of questions about wood selection, a lot of questions about what types of tools to use. That actually generated a lot more questions. One of the early installments of the construction series was the toolbox article. So in addition to getting a lot of questions, I also got a lot of suggestions from readers on tools that they had found or sources for tools that they're pleased with. But gathering up the tools to get started was a pretty ripe area for questions.
Right. Well, one of the things that I noticed is in regards to your designs is that a majority of them have been warbirds. Can you tell us a little bit about this inspiration?
Yeah, that definitely goes back to growing up on Air Force bases. It's always had a love for the warbirds, all the 60s jets, the World War II stuff. Interested in World War I as well, but really the World War II era aircraft are the ones that are really loved the most. And just it's fun to work on those projects. The time it takes to develop a design and then build the prototype. Typically, it's about a 5-month process for me. And during that period, there's a lot of research about the aircraft itself, but you also learn so much about the people that operated those aircraft and the incredible stories of the people that were caught up in those times. So I find that very compelling.
Well, yes, especially with a scale project, it is always interesting when you pick a color scheme to research the pilot or the history of the aircraft or the squadron. Do you find that you do that as well?
I do. Yeah, that definitely has a lot to do with how the final decision is made on the particular paint scheme. The warbirds have all been modeled after a particular aircraft, and more often than not, the story of the pilot that flew that aircraft is what really tipped the scale toward the particular paint scheme. And of course, with the internet, there's just so much information out there, but we'll end up spending a few nights just reading these stories, and just it becomes a bit of a sidetrack, but it's well worth it. Just a lot of history.
When you chose to model a warbird like a lot of them that you've done, as you mentioned, are World War II, is it a story that you've read or a pilot that you are aware of that was that what started you to design that aircraft, or were you interested in that aircraft and then you took that and then found a scheme or a story that you liked? How does that work?
Well, so far it's been a lot more of the second choice, the selection of the aircraft first, and then gravitating toward a particular pilot story. But for the most part, I've really just picked off the airplanes that I've always loved since I was a kid. The Ka-61 is a good example. I remember my uncle had built a plastic model when I was about 8, and I just always thought that was such a beautiful airplane. And when I was looking for subjects to design, that was just a real natural, just such a clean and beautiful aircraft, and unusual for the Japanese aircraft of the era. And then in doing the research, reading about the pilot that I chose to model, so that pilot was Major Kobayashi, who was an incredible leader, to say the least. He actually personally crashed his airplane into 2 different B-29s and lived to tell the tale. So it's just amazing the kind of commitment and sacrifice that people from all nations were making during that conflict. And when I see that airplane fly, and it really is a piece of living history in my eyes. Of course, maybe other people don't see it, but after the time that's gone into it and the contemplation, I just feel a real connection.
Paul, about how many aircraft would you say you've designed?
I've done 14 different designs now, and there's a couple that are just one-offs that have been fun and interesting, but just not really right for sharing, I guess. But the majority of them have been finished and put into a presentable form.
I'm going to take a question that I see that we've gotten online. It says specifically, are there any plans to do a beginner series of building for a first trainer airplane? it's probably more for me than you, but since we talked about your designs, Paul, your 14 designs, are any of those a beginner or a trainer, or has it all been scale subjects?
They have all been scale subjects, and that's a great question. But as I mentioned, for me, I'm probably not the right resource because it does take a bit of time, and with the other things that are going on with family and the job and such, and to be pretty selective about what subjects I personally take on. But I would imagine there's somebody willing to step up to take that job. I think that's a great idea.
Absolutely, and obviously the AMA Plan Service has aircraft that cover all the different ranges and interests, and we also took over the Northrop plans as well that were featured in Model Builder, so there's a lot to choose from.
Right.
So of the 14 planes, they have 14 airplanes that you've designed, Paul, do you have a favorite?
I do have a favorite. And oddly enough, it's split between the two that were published in Model Aviation. The Goose is kind of a funny one. I actually designed that Goose at your request. You had an interest in finding a designer that would take that on, and I thought it sounded like an okay project, but I can't say I was a tremendous Goose fan at that time, but I just really fell in love with that airplane. The airplane generally, not just my model, but it's just such an incredible aircraft and tremendous history, and the end result is a really nice flying airplane, and I've learned that flying off the water is a lot more rewarding than flying the land-based airplanes. My son and I fly off a local pond quite a bit, so when I get the chance to fly it, I'm usually with him and just really enjoy that time. So that airplane brings back a lot of great memories. But the M20, I just love the way that airplane looks. It's such a funny little obscure airplane, but it's just really pretty and elegant. And it's got a few more details on it than when it was last seen in the magazine, but it's 100% complete now, and I just love to look at it.
You'll have to send us a picture of the updated version that we can post on our website.
All right, I'll do that.
You mentioned, Paul, that your son also is involved, and I remember that you shared a story about a B-25, that your son was interested in modeling the B-25, I believe, because there was one local to you. Tell us a little bit about that and his involvement in the hobby.
Oh, absolutely. I love to talk about this story. My next-door neighbor's name is Steve Penning, and he, at that time, he had a business restoring vintage aircraft, which for him primarily meant World War II aircraft, and he was part owner of a full-scale B-25, and we lived just a few miles down the road from the local airport where it was based. So my son, from the time he was about 5, he had been around that airplane and crawled all over it, and he didn't really realize there was anything special about being able to hang out with a B-25 anytime he felt like it. But at one point, while I was working on a project in the garage, he suggested that we build an airplane together from the design all the way through completion and flying. And it sounded like a pretty big project. He was, I think he was 8 or 9 at the time. But I'll be darned if he didn't do it. He learned quite a bit of CAD. I taught him some basics, and he helped with the design of the airplane. And then he was there for every step of the building and the covering and the maiden. And then he flew it once he was prepared to, and he's flown that airplane quite a bit now. But we did model it after our neighbor Steve's airplane, a Sunday Punch, and it's a pretty fair copy, I would say. But I'm really proud of the fact that my son did so much work on that project.
Has he taken on any other projects since then? Has he built any other aircraft or worked on them with you?
You know, I was hopeful that that's the way it would go, but, kids today have so many options that he is pretty much focused on playing football and just doing pretty well in school and hanging out with his buddies. But I'm a little sorry to say that he really didn't stick with the building. He does a fair amount of flying. He's pylon racing with our club, but not any building at this time.
Fair enough. So Obviously, as you mentioned, there's been 14 aircraft that you yourself have designed. So, what lessons have you learned, Paul, from either designing, building, and flying your own personal aircraft?
Well, I guess the biggest lesson is just that when you build the airframe, it really doesn't cost very much. It's a fair amount of time, but the actual expense is pretty low. And the reason I mention that is just that I've gotten to a point where I realize there's just not that much risk in trying your hand at designing something, and maybe it's a little different than the last thing, or maybe it's the first time you've done it. But you know, if things just don't quite work out, it really isn't that big of a deal. You can always remove the electronics and try again, or more often than not, things are repairable and you can figure out what went wrong. But just found it's actually a pretty low risk proposition. You know, it's interesting to me. A lot of people are concerned that if they put that much time into a model rather than go the ARF route, which I don't have any issue with, but you know, there's just not that much invested. But in my mind, the investment is worth an awful lot, and having something that's unique is worth a lot, and the risk is pretty low.
I always look at a model that you construct yourself, either, you know, whether it's from a kit or a short kit, or you cut everything yourself. It's kind of like an artist's canvas, you know. There's, because you have so many choices. I mean, even once you've decided on the actual model, there's so many choices in colors and schemes, and you know, whether you want to do it historic or if you want to do something that you know, is totally your own. Do you feel the same way?
I absolutely do. Yeah, there's, again, with the internet, it's funny. I'll spend a little bit of time here and there just looking at airplanes, and it's the kind of exercise where you start looking for information on a Hawker Typhoon, and then you find a link to a similar airplane, and next thing you know, you're looking at Martin Baker's, which I didn't know much about at all, but there's some beautiful airplanes there, and the next thing you know, you're looking at something really obscure. There's just an endless number of subjects, and of course, if you're not constrained to building something scale, the range of choices gets even wider. But today, with the kind of tremendously high power densities that we have in LiPo batteries and electrical systems, you can get away with an awful lot. You can make virtually anything fly today.
Going back to the, you know, the whole process that you go through from the design to the build to the I guess you could call it test flying in the very beginning, and then if everything goes well, flying. What do you find is the most challenging part of that? Is there a specific piece that's the most challenging?
Oh, that's a pretty good question. I think probably the trickiest part is during the design phase. It's not too hard to figure out how to make the, you know, I design everything in CAD on the computer, and everything, you know, get everything to look right is pretty straightforward. Then to break things down into a framework is pretty straightforward, but finding the right way to get access to all of the internal components and make sure that your controls are able to be rigged, make sure that it's possible to arrange the parts and move the battery to get the proper CG. That portion sometimes takes a little bit of extra time. Sometimes things pop up that you didn't anticipate that can slow the project down a bit. But it's really that phase right there of you know, building the framework is straightforward, but making sure that that the internals are placed properly, and that it isn't a one-off. You know, when you're building a prototype, it's easy to come up with workarounds to things that weren't designed very well. But when you turn that design loose to other people, then you need to do a better job for that. So I'm always interested in hearing feedback from people that have built the designs that I've done, and just check my work, see how I'm doing. But that's the area that I worry about the most.
When you decide on an aircraft, let's just take the Miles M20 as an example. And so you're gonna you determine the scale you want, and you sit down to use your computer to come up with the plan and draw it all out. What are you using? Are you using photographs? Are you using a 3-view? Are you using a little bit of both? I mean, generally speaking, what are you drawing off of to make the plan?
You really need as much documentation as you can get a hold of. It's the design always starts with a 3-view drawing, and the 3 views are used to construct outlines within the CAD program. And then those outlines go on different planes and can be arranged within the software to start building on. But the 3 views always have a lot of space in between the views that aren't crystal clear. So the photographs really help you look at the shading and try to understand exactly what the shape is of the cowling and exactly how the tail group fits together. And it's difficult to get too much information. And in fact, it's often the case where you find a drawing that just looks great and you feel like that's everything you're going to need, and then you get halfway through the through the design and realize that there's a photograph that clears up something you didn't quite understand before, and then you go back to do some rework. So spending the extra time to get as much documentation at the beginning of the project is time well spent.
Paul, do you often deviate at all to try to make the airplane fly better, whether it be making the tail a little larger, or do you try to get as close to scale as possible?
A little deviation is not a bad thing. We talk a lot about Reynolds numbers, and we're all aware that our aircraft are operating in a different Reynolds number regime. But over the years, I've gotten out of the habit of increasing the tail. I used to do that just right off of the bat, but it really hasn't turned out to be that critical with the really lightweight stuff. And but in the case of the airfoils, I always go with airfoil that I'm familiar with, and sometimes I'll adjust it a little bit for the application, but there's a couple of airfoils that I really like to use, and I don't concern myself much with the full-scale aircraft's airfoils. Just don't think they're that relevant for a model unless they're really particular and give a certain appearance, but for flying performance, they're not relevant to a model airplane.
When it comes to the gear you put in, I guess maybe specifically the power system, are you using anything like MotoCalc, or are you just basically going off past experience, or how are you determining the power plant and the gear?
That's mostly from experience. I'd like to say I use MotoCalc. I think that's a great method, but for some reason that's one area that I've just been a little bit lazy in. So I tend to have several power systems that I really like, and I tend to build around those. Alternatively, I'll rely on other builders that are more electrically oriented than I am. Some of us are really excited about characterizing those power systems, and I'll ask those builders for some information, and generally I find that our community is really collaborative. So I just assume go to somebody that has more interest in that area and just pick their brains a little bit.
On the 14 aircraft that you designed, have you made any major changes as far as, I mean, obviously you're probably testing different props, but have you found that anything was underpowered, or is everything that you've produced so far, has the power plant that you started with ended up being the one you finished with?
There's been two that I wasn't happy with. One of them I was on the fence, and so I expected that I'd need more power. I did a 45-inch Messerschmitt 109, and I started out with 450 power, and I really wanted it to be extra light, but I guess you could say that it flies perfectly scale, but the reality is most of us are used to having much, much more power than what the scale aircraft had, so it just wasn't quite as exciting to fly, so it got an upgrade. And the other was a little DGA to the Howard Pete, and that one is built around an older T-28 UMX, and the whole point of the project was to see what I could do with that little the brick and the little brush power system. And that airplane, it's kind of similar, I guess. It flies in a scale manner, but not as much power as we'd like compared to most of the stuff that we fly today. So it's on the bench waiting to get a two-cell brushed upgrade from a little UMX Beast now.
Ah, obviously the availability of all these power systems and radio systems that are in these micro models has made it a lot easier to put together a model and use the brick, as they call it. How did you find that process, making the Pete?
Now, it's incredibly easy. It's just amazing how much engineering that the providers of the electronics have done, that the system is so well integrated. Basically, you just hook some push rods to it and mount another, a separate servo for your ailerons, and you're off and running. But it's amazing how much work they've done to make that a virtually foolproof system. And that's one thing I'd like to check on periodically on RC groups. There's a thread there that's dedicated to people using the brick to build, anything is welcome. Just show us what you've done with your brick, and it's mind-boggling the range of different types of aircraft that people have built using those basic systems.
Do you have any plans beyond the Pete, do you think, to use that technology in another model, or are you going to go for the slightly larger stuff?
Well, like a lot of builders, it seems that every time you go a little bit bigger, you just realize the airplane flies a little better, and I'm definitely headed in that direction. There's a limit to how big I can go. Here where I live in Sonoma County, in the northern end of the county, it's virtually every square foot is covered with vineyard, and it's hard to find open space to fly. So that's a big part of the reason why I really like the stick and tissue type of construction technique. I can build fairly large aircraft that are very low in wing loading, and I can fly good-sized stuff on a softball field. So we'll see how far I can go and still fly in the parks as much as I do. I fly with a couple of clubs as well, but it's really convenient just to run down the street. So yeah, heading toward the bigger side, but my big side is not that big in the grand scheme of things. I'm really limited to around 50 inches so far.
Obviously, we talked about the Grumman Goose, and I've shared with you, and we've shared online, that it actually became the best-selling model that we've offered through that was featured in Model Aviation through our plan service. What's it like, Paul, to see other people model your aircraft? Either you see it online, or maybe you've seen, I don't know, have you seen any in person? I mean, what's it like to hear the feedback and to see people enjoying your designs?
Well, that's been a lot of fun, and at first it was really strange to see people send pictures of the airplane being framed up on their workbench, because before the covering goes on, they all look the same, and it was just really odd to see my airplane on somebody else's workbench in their workspace. But it's really rewarding to see those projects be finished and people fly them. And that one, I've gotten a lot of kindly worded notes back that people really enjoy flying that airplane, and it's great to hear that the design is doing as well for them as it is for me. I just flew mine a couple of weeks ago, and I just really enjoy it. But one funny thing about it is I felt pretty good about how mine turned out. I thought it looked really nice, but the reality is that every one of the photos that I've seen of somebody else that finished one, and that's about 20 people or so, literally every single one of them looks so much better than mine. They've just done fantastic work, and that's been been a good challenge for me.
Have you seen any of your designs in person, either at any of the flying sites you fly at, or if you've ever attended any events? Have you seen anyone else, in person with one of your designs?
No, to be honest, I haven't, and that's something I rib on a few of the builders in our club about. I've given a few of the. Usually, what happens is I'll build.
for him to call back. Paul, you with me?
I am.
Okay, I don't know what happened there. I'm sorry we lost you.
Oh, that's okay. I'm back now.
Okay, so you were saying that you had some builders in your club, and I think that's around where we lost you.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I was saying that that second prototype is just a checkoff for the cut file. So Charlie Manzano will send me the kit that he cuts, and we use that to make sure that the kit is buildable, that there's no errors in it. I'll frame that up, but I don't need two of any particular design. So I'll just, once it's framed and the cut file is checked off, I'll pass it on to a builder in our club. But so far, I haven't seen one of those ones finished yet. So it's a good opportunity to rib on a couple of people when I see them around the field, but in a good-natured way.
I also want to take a moment to remind everybody that's listening, if you have any questions for Paul, please just write your question and we'll be happy to ask Paul. Paul, you mentioned Charlie over at Manzano. I know you've used him for several of your designs, obviously offering kits to make things easier. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, actually, that's been a fantastic relationship. I can't think of anybody that's supporting the hobby more than Charlie is, and specifically, I mean that anybody that is interested in trying their hand at building and develops a cut file, he's been a really helpful resource to understand how to set the files up so that the laser can cut it, and they do fantastic work. But in addition to being able to order stuff other designers have done, he's been really supportive of builders interested in trying their hand themselves. So he's really a fantastic person, and he's on RC groups quite a bit, helping out with ideas and experiences with other people. So just fantastic people to work with. He and his wife operate that business together and do an amazing job at it.
Excellent. And obviously he's done the Miles M20 and the Grumman Goose that we've discussed. He has kits on both of those.
That's true.
So one of the questions that we had, Paul, was about sheeting and about forming sheeting. Do you have some tips and tricks to forming sheeting?
I've got a couple of tricks. Most every design that I've done uses a D-box structure on the front of the wing. So from the main spar to the leading edge is sheeted with balsa, and that is actually a pretty simple thing to do if the outer surface is just dampened lightly. The wood will naturally curl and just fit right into place. So a little water is always a good thing. I don't do too many sheeted fuselages. Sometimes I'll sheet just around the front of the cowling or something in that area. But for the most part, my designs don't have very much sheeting. But in the cases where I have sheeted compound curves, that it's a little trickier. I wouldn't say I'm an expert at that, but go slow and trim carefully. I guess that's probably the limit of my advice there.
Another question we've had is about adhesives and what you think the best adhesives are. You know, maybe if you want to just give a brief overview of the main adhesives you use and where you like to use them in the build.
Sure. I use Tight Bond wood glue for about 90% of the construction. As I mentioned earlier, I really don't like working with CA very much. The health concerns bother me. I work around some other similar chemistries at work, and I just try to avoid that as much as possible. But Tight Bond, if you're a little more patient, it works great. Sets up pretty quickly, sandable. It hardens over a period of a day or so. but within that first day or so, it's very sandable. Afterwards, it can get pretty tough. But I like that for virtually all of the construction, all of the sheeting. Then I'll use epoxy for really critical areas, so around the motor mount, etc. Anything that it really has to hold up. A lot of times I'll mix that epoxy 50-50 with glass spheres to make sure that the epoxy is nice and light, but it also helps strengthen the bond a bit. I do use CA from time to time, but it's pretty rare. And I use Gorilla Glue from time to time, but again, pretty rare. But that's it, really. For me, it's Titebond for almost everything.
Obviously, Titebond also is a very easy cleanup, but I'm assuming that when you use that, you're clamping in most cases, is correct?
That's true, clamping or pinning.
Right.
You asked about my building area and the building board. I haven't made the switch to a magnetic board yet. I keep threatening to do that. I think that's a better solution once you get it set up. But right now it's all pinning parts together and clamping, weighting things down. We live pretty close to the coast, so I got a few bags of beach sand. There's Ziploc bags. We propped over parts to hold them in place.
Right. What about, you talked about in the MA Construction Series about making your own decals. Could you talk a little bit about that? I know that you've done it for several aircraft now.
I have. Actually, I just use some very simple softwares. Can't say I'm a graphic artist, but I've figured out how to do some pretty basic things just using the clip art tools in Word and the Paint program. There's a lot better softwares out there to get the job done, but rather than turn that into a project unto itself, I've just figured out some basics on how to create graphics. The first step, of course, is try to steal as much as you can. There's an awful lot of the graphics that are available, either just searching online, perhaps color plates out of aircraft books that are specific to the project that you're working on. You might be able to find all of the graphics that you need. Alternatively, there's collections of graphics. For instance, there's one on RC groups. There's probably several, actually, just different threads that contain tons of little bits of art that could be insignia or different types of graphics, serial numbers and the like. Just try to collect all of those and then put them into to Microsoft Paint, just that little CAN program that comes with your Office suite. And I use that to resize those. You can change colors, nest those graphics so that they fit onto a sheet neatly. Once you get everything so that it looks about right, then I'll print off a sheet just on plain paper, and then cut those graphics out and fit them into place and make sure that they look right. And once I'm 100% sure that they look the way they ought to look, then I'll go ahead and print on the decal paper. The decal paper you can get from a couple of places. I order it from Papilio online, and it just goes right through your printer like any other paper, a color printer, and it's about that easy. You just hit the print button and go. It comes out, but because it's a decal and not a paper, that surface doesn't absorb ink, so it takes it quite a bit longer to dry than a paper would. But you just let it dry, and then once it's completely dry, you seal it with acrylic clear coat, cut those decals out, and put them on just like the ones that we did in plastic models when we were kids.
Well, that's true. I guess the basic idea is very similar. Have you, on all the models that you've done, Paul, have you made your own decals, or have you used any of the services that make them for some?
I've done both, but the process is pretty similar if I'm making my own decals or if I'm ordering vinyl decals. you still need to make the graphics file. So I'll build up the graphics file so that everything is the way I want it, and then I'll send that over to Callie Graphics, and she'll print those out on vinyl, and they come pre-cut and ready to go. And these days, actually, I'm doing that a lot more often than making my own decals. The decals work really well, but the vinyl's hard to beat. They stick like crazy, and Callie does a fantastic job. So I found that it's a little bit easier to just send them over to her, let her take care of that while I focus my attention on other areas. The projects go a little bit quicker that way.
If someone was fairly new to building, obviously they can follow along in Model Aviation over your MA Construction Series, and a lot of that article talked about building the Miles M20. Are there any other designs that you've done that you would say were maybe a little more simple for someone that doesn't have a lot of building experience? I mean, so there's definitely the Miles M20, but is there any other designs that you might steer them to if they wanted to take on a build project?
There's 4 little warbirds right now. They're 30-inch airplanes. There's a Wildcat, F4F Wildcat, a little 109, Messerschmitt 109. There's a Ka-84, and then the Ka-61 Tony. And those 4 airplanes, because they're smaller, they're a little easier. The parts count is lower, and they're pretty straightforward to build. I wouldn't say that they're beginners builds necessarily, but they're pretty manageable. What's probably more important is I think they're not a terrible choice for a new modeler, but they would not be a good choice for a new RC pilot. That's not necessarily the same thing, but yeah, those projects are pretty manageable. And because they're smaller, they're really inexpensive to outfit. The power plants are $10. That was one of the main attractions for getting started in that area. That's where I began in design, was those little 30-inch airplanes. They're just really cheap to outfit and quick to build.
And the 4 that you've mentioned, those are all available through Manzano as a kit?
That's true, yes.
Are they short kits or full kits, do you know?
They're short kits. They have the plastic parts, the canopies and spinners and cowlings if appropriate, the wood that you need. There's enough wood for, there should be enough wood for all the stringers and such, but a couple odds and ends would be required. And of course the electronics and control linkages and such are up to the builder.
And if someone was to take on one of those projects, as far as the way they fly, are they similar, or is one any easier than another?
Some are a little easier. They're all pretty easy, but because the wing loadings are really low, if the suggested power plants are used, these little airplanes are 30 inches, and they come out all ready to fly at around 8 or 9 ounces. But the ones with the longer tail moments, particularly the 109, it flies the best. The K61 is close to it, but they all fly really nicely. And again, they're, like I said earlier, they're really easy to fly around a softball field. Something you just pop out at your local park and fly. And
I believe they don't have gear, is that right? Or can you build them either way?
Well, you could add them in. In fact, the K61, I just built a second wing, and I put mechanical retracts in it, and that worked really nicely. But the basic design does not have any plan for installing retracts, so that would be a sub-project.
Well, obviously, to keep them light, you can hand launch them and belly land them.
That's right.
And, you did talk earlier on about the peat, and I was going to kind of mention towards the end here that that's something that we will be featuring very soon in Model Aviation. Is there anything that you want to point out about that aircraft, the design or flying or building, for those that might have interest in a micro peat?
Yeah, actually, I'm glad you brought that up. I'm looking forward to seeing that in the magazine. Hopefully that that article will be enjoyable for your readers. That one's a good example of an airplane that just has such an incredible history. It was a teeny tiny little airplane, but it was racing with the best racers in the world in 1930, and that included an entry that was backed by the U.S. military at that time. There was a lot of involvement with the military in the Snyder Cup and the Thompson Trophy races, but Benny Howard, the designer of that airplane, must have been an incredible character. He built that little airplane and raced with these much, much more powerful airplanes. And interestingly, at the end of the day, his little airplane that was probably had about half the power of some of the bigger jobs ended up coming in third place. And that was largely because his airplane was still running. Mechanical problems were definitely a big issue for other racers. But the little airplane is just really cute, and it's the one that we discussed earlier, built around the brick. It's a little 20-inch stick and tissue airplane. So it's a little thing. It's a good project for a very limited building space, limited time. It's a fun build. It's pretty straightforward, pretty simple, but as mentioned in the article, it's built around the old brush motor, and it could use a little more power to make it more exciting, but it'll certainly get around the field with the basic brush setup.
Well, I think that you should design at least one other so that people can build them and do some pylon racing.
That would be fun.
So hopefully you'll make another one down the road.
Well, we'll see. I keep proposing in our club that we do some crazy stuff like that. Perhaps just build really simple pylon racers out of flat sheet foam, and there would be some combination between pylon racing and combat, I think. But it sounds like it'd be a lot of fun. But it can be pretty tough to find enough builders these days. So we got to stick together, I guess.
Right. Well, we've been talking, Paul, for almost an hour here, and obviously we touched on some questions, and we talked about some of your background and some of the tips and whatnot that you have for building. Is there anything that we haven't touched on in our conversation that you might want to point out before we go?
Well, that's a good question. I've been so busy just trying to keep up with you. I haven't had time to think about that, to be honest with you.
Well, as an example, I mean, obviously people can look back over Model Aviation, over all I think it was 11 articles that you did, and obviously there's the construction articles as well. But maybe one thing to think about is, do you have any suggestions for anyone who is interested in taking this on, as far as let's say the miles, because that one obviously does not have the issue of retracts. Is there anything you mentioned that you've made some minor changes? I'm assuming those are just added scale details. Is there anything, like if someone took that on, is there anything different that you would recommend now from when we published the plan?
No, actually, that one I'm real happy with the CG placement. I'm happy with the everything about the angles, the way it's designed. I haven't made any changes to it to improve the way it flies. It's one that was done pretty well. So yeah, I'd say that it can be built right off of the plan. And one thing that I would mention, I guess, is that each one of the designs that I've done, each plan gets a little more involved in the sense that there's a lot more information. I'm learning as I go what kind of information people need and things that they might be confused by, and there's a lot more notes in there. There's quite a bit of information on the plan to help people get that airplane put together properly. So just follow the plan, should get you there. And yeah, the changes that I've made since the article was published, they're all just little details here and there. Nothing to change the way that it flies. So I'll stand behind that design. It should fly just fine, if built to the plan.
So just a little added scale detail.
Yeah. Yep.
And I think it's also important to remind the readers, if they do decide to take on any of your designs, be it the Grumman Goose or the M20 or any of your other designs, every construction article that you've done for us and every article you've done for us, it has your email address. So if anyone has questions for Paul as they're building one of these airplanes, or has questions even before they take on the project, I know, Paul, that you're more than happy to hear from our readers and respond to them.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been great to hear from people, and it's always a thrill to hear people that are working on these projects, and it's been fun to talk with them. So I'm happy to answer questions.
Excellent. Well, Paul, I really want to thank you for being part of this podcast, and I also want to appreciate everyone else who's listened in. Keep in mind, if you enjoy Paul's contributions and you're interested in his designs, we will have the Pete soon. And on behalf of Model Aviation Magazine and the AMA, thank you and have a good evening.
Thanks, Shane.